I knew my marriage was over the moment I saw my husband smile like that. Not at me. At her. The restaurant lights were soft and golden, the kind that made everything feel warmer than it really was. It should have been our night. 5 years of marriage. 5 years of building a life together. This was supposed to be our anniversary dinner. Instead, I stood there just inside the entrance, my hand still wrapped around the strap of my purse, watching Austin lean forward and gently tuck a strand of hair behind another woman's ear. "Anna," she laughed, low and intimate, like she had every right to be there, like she belonged in that seat across from him. For a second, I honestly wondered if I had walked into the wrong life. Then I saw the reservation card sitting between them on the table. White. Simple. Elegant. His name printed neatly across it. Not ours. His. And that was when something inside me went completely still. I didn't cry. I didn't turn around. I didn't even breathe for a moment. I just stepped forward. Past their table. Past the version of my life I thought I understood. And I sat down at the table right next to them. Across from me, already waiting, was a man who didn't look surprised to see me at all. Brandon sat there with his hands folded calmly in front of him, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on the same scene I had just walked into. Her husband. I leaned slightly closer, just enough so my voice would carry, "Happy anniversary," I said softly. "To all of us." For a heartbeat. Nothing moved. Then everything did. The restaurant itself was exactly the kind of place Austin would choose for something he wanted to look perfect. Dark wood tables, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, a pianist in the corner playing something slow and expensive. Every detail was curated. Every table spaced just far enough apart to feel private, but not so far that you couldn't hear the right kind of conversation if you tried. I had never been here before. That detail sat heavier in my chest than anything else. I lowered my gaze briefly, steadying myself, letting the sounds settle around me. Glasses clinking, low conversations, the quiet rhythm of the piano. It all felt unreal, like I had stepped into a scene that had already been happening long before I arrived. Across from me, Brandon didn't speak. He didn't need to. There was something about the way he held himself, controlled, composed, almost detached, that told me he had already lived through this moment in his mind more than once. His eyes flicked toward me for just a second, then back to them. No questions, no hesitation, just understanding. I followed his gaze again, letting myself really look this time. Austin was leaning back slightly now, his posture relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months. His tie was loosened just enough to look effortless. He was smiling again, different from the polite, distracted smiles he gave me lately. This one was softer, easier, real. Anna reached across the table and touched his wrist, her fingers lingering there like it was the most natural thing in the world. He didn't pull away. He turned his hand slightly, almost instinctively, letting her hold it. That small movement landed harder than anything else. 5 years. And somehow, that tiny gesture told me everything I hadn't wanted to admit. I felt the air leave my lungs slowly. But I didn't look away. Not anymore. "You okay?" Brandon's voice was low, barely above a whisper. I nodded once. "I'm past that part," I said. He studied me for a second, like he was deciding whether to believe me, then gave the smallest nod back. "Good," he said quietly, "because this is where it starts." I didn't ask him what he meant. I already knew. At the table beside us, Anna lifted her glass, her smile widening. "To new beginnings," she said. Austin hesitated for half a second. Just half. Then he raised his glass too. "To us," he replied. The words settled into the space between them like something practiced, like something that had been said before. Not new, just hidden. My fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table, but my face stayed calm. That was the part I had decided on before I ever walked in here. No scene. No emotion they could twist or use against me. Just truth. I noticed then how close their chairs were angled toward each other, how easily they leaned in, how naturally their conversation flowed. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation, no sign that this was something new or uncertain. This wasn't a mistake. This was a pattern. A life they had already started building without me. Brandon shifted slightly in his seat, drawing just enough attention to break the illusion. Anna's eyes moved first. She glanced over, her expression neutral at first, then slightly curious, then confused, then something sharper. Her gaze dropped to the table, to Brandon's face, and I watched the exact moment recognition hit her. Her posture stiffened, her fingers pulling back from Austin's hand like she had just been burned. Austin noticed the change immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked, turning slightly toward her. She didn't answer. She was still staring. At Brandon, at me, at everything that wasn't supposed to be here. That was when Austin followed her gaze. Slowly, casually at first, and then not casually at all. His eyes met mine, and I saw it happen in real time, the shift, the flicker of confusion, then recognition, then something deeper, fear. His smile didn't just fade, it collapsed. For a second, he looked like he might say something, like he might try to pull this moment back into something manageable, something he could control. But there was no version of this he could control anymore. Not with me sitting there, not with Brandon across from me, not with the truth already out in the open, even if no one had said it yet. I held his gaze, steady and unblinking, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like the one who had been left out. I felt like the one who had finally walked in, right on time. A few weeks before that night, my life still looked like something people envied. From the outside, Austin and I were the couple everyone pointed to when they talked about making it work. 5 years of marriage. No dramatic fights. No public cracks. He had his career as an event manager, busy, successful, always in demand, and I had my steady job in sales. We weren't glamorous, but we were stable, predictable, safe. At least, that's what I told myself. Because the truth didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, forgettable moments that didn't seem important until they started forming a pattern I couldn't ignore. It began with time. Austin started coming home later than usual. At first, it made sense. His job was unpredictable, last-minute changes, demanding clients, events that stretched longer than planned. I had always respected that about him. The way he handled pressure, the way he adapted. So when he walked in at 10 instead of 8, loosening his tie and apologizing with a tired smile, I believed him. "Client ran over," he would say, dropping his keys into the bowl by the door. "You know how it is." And I did. Or at least, I thought I did. But then it wasn't just once or twice. It became every night. Dinner would sit untouched on the table until I finally packed it away. The silence in the apartment stretched longer, heavier, until I started filling it with noise, TV shows I didn't really watch, music I didn't really hear. When he did come home, he seemed elsewhere, not distant in a dramatic way, just slightly out of reach, like he was always thinking about something else. Our conversations shortened. The easy rhythm we used to have faded into something polite, almost rehearsed. "How was your day?" I'd ask. "Busy?" He'd reply. "Anything interesting?" "Not really." And then silence again. I told myself it was just a phase. That work was demanding. That marriages went through seasons. I didn't want to be the kind of wife who overanalyzed everything. Then I noticed the phone. It was such a small detail. I almost dismissed it at first. Austin had always been casual with his phone, leaving it on the counter, scrolling through messages in front of me, sometimes even handing it to me without thinking. There had never been anything to hide. But suddenly, there was... He started placing it face down whenever he set it down. Not aggressively. Not in a way that would draw attention. Just deliberately. At dinner, on the coffee table, even on his nightstand. Face down. Like the screen itself had become something I wasn't allowed to see. One night, I watched him out of the corner of my eye as his phone buzzed against the table. He glanced at it quickly, his expression shifting for just a fraction of a second before he flipped it over, silencing the notification. He didn't check it right away. He waited. Waited until I stood up to take my plate to the sink, until my back was turned, before picking it up and walking into the other room. I stood there, my hand resting on the edge of the counter, listening to the faint murmur of his voice through the wall, soft, almost careful. When he came back, he smiled at me like nothing had happened.
Work?
I asked, keeping my tone light. Yeah, he said without hesitation. Just confirming something for tomorrow. I nodded. And for the first time, I didn't believe him. That feeling didn't explode into anything dramatic. It just sat there, quiet and uncomfortable, like a thought I couldn't quite shake. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into normal behavior, that I was turning into someone I didn't want to be. But then there were the messages. Not what they said, I never saw them. It was how he reacted to them. He would glance at his phone and smile. A small, private smile that didn't belong to me. Sometimes he would type quickly, his fingers moving with a kind of ease I hadn't seen in months. One night, I asked him what he was laughing at. Just something from work, he said, barely looking up. I waited for him to show me. He didn't. That was when something inside me shifted. Not into anger. Not yet. Just awareness. A few days later, I opened our shared banking app on my phone. It wasn't unusual. I handled most of our day-to-day finances. Kept track of bills. Made sure everything stayed balanced. At first, nothing stood out. Groceries. Utilities. Regular expenses. Then I saw it. A charge from a restaurant I didn't recognize. It wasn't the amount that caught my attention. It was the name. High-end. Upscale. The kind of place people went for special occasions. I stared at it for a moment, trying to remember if we had ever talked about going there. We hadn't. I scrolled back. Another charge. Same place. Different date. A third one. A week earlier. All on nights when Austin had come home late. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. There could be explanations. Work dinners. Client meetings. Networking events. It all fit his job. It all made sense. Until I checked the dates. One of the charges landed on a night I remembered clearly. I had texted him that evening, asking if he'd be home for dinner. He had replied almost immediately. Can't. Big event tonight. Might be late. I looked at the transaction again. Same night. Same time. Same place. A restaurant. Not an event venue. Not a client site. A restaurant. I set my phone down slowly, my mind replaying every detail, every excuse, every late night. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at nothing. Then I picked up the phone again and looked at the date of our anniversary. 5 years. It was coming up in a few days. I had been waiting for him to say something, to plan something, to acknowledge it. He hadn't. Instead, he had told me he'd be busy. A VIP event, he said casually, like it was just another day. I went back to the transaction history, and there it was. A new charge. Same restaurant. Reservation fee. Dated exactly on our anniversary night. I felt something settle into place inside me. Not panic. Not heartbreak. Clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't work. This was something else. Something deliberate. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, letting the truth form without trying to soften it. He hadn't forgotten our anniversary. He had just chosen to spend it with someone else. And that was the moment I stopped asking myself if something was wrong, and started asking how much of my life had already been replaced without me noticing. I stopped asking questions out loud after that. Not because I didn't have them, because I already knew the answers wouldn't be honest. Instead, I started watching, really watching. It changed the way everything felt. The apartment. The quiet dinners. even the way Austin moved through the space. It was like I had been living inside a version of my life where the details didn't matter. And suddenly, they were all I could see. Patterns. Timing. Gaps. He left earlier than he used to. Not by much. Just enough to make it seem normal if you didn't look too closely. "I've got to get ahead of setup today," he said one morning, grabbing his jacket before I even finished my coffee. I nodded. Like I always did. "Busy week?" I asked. "Yeah. Big clients." "You know how it is?" I did. Or at least, I had always believed I did. That night, he came home later than usual. Again, his shirt smelled faintly of something that wasn't the usual mix of cologne and event space air. Something lighter. Warmer. Familiar? But not mine. I didn't say anything. I just filed it away. The next few days followed the same rhythm. Early mornings. Late nights. Vague explanations that sounded reasonable enough if you didn't try to line them up side by side. So I did exactly that. I started paying attention to the details he assumed I wouldn't notice. The way he checked his phone before speaking. The way his tone shifted when he stepped into another room. The slight hesitation before answering simple questions. Like he was choosing the version of the truth he wanted to give me. One night, we were sitting across from each other at the kitchen table. Dinner half finished. The TV murmuring softly in the background. His phone buzzed against the surface. He glanced down at it and smiled. It wasn't a big smile. Just a small, private one. But it didn't belong to me. I watched him turn the phone over, screen facing down, like it was instinct now. Like he had done it so many times it didn't even register as a decision anymore. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he said quickly. "Just work stuff." I held his gaze for a second longer than usual. "Seems like work's been keeping you busy." He shrugged, picking up his fork again. "It's that time of year." "That time of year." I nodded slowly, letting the conversation end there. But inside, something was tightening. Later that night, I was in the kitchen rinsing dishes when I heard his chair scrape back. His footsteps moved quickly across the living room. Then the soft click of the front door opening. I paused, water still running over my hands. "Where are you going?" I called out. "Just taking a call," he said. "Already halfway outside. Better reception." "Better reception." I dried my hands slowly, my eyes fixed on the door. Through the thin wall, I could hear the faint murmur of his voice. Low, soft, different. I moved closer without meaning to, stopping just short of the door, listening. There was something in the way he spoke, lighter, almost careful, like he was choosing his words not to be heard, but to be felt. I didn't catch everything, just enough. A quiet laugh, a pause. Then his voice again, softer than before. "Yeah, I miss that too." The words landed harder than they should have. I stepped back, my chest tightening, and forced myself to move away from the door. When he came back inside a few minutes later, his expression was neutral again, controlled, like nothing had happened. "Everything good?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Yeah," he said, setting his phone down. "Just confirming details for tomorrow." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. He was lying. Not badly, not obviously, but enough. Enough that I couldn't pretend I didn't see it anymore. That night, I lay awake long after he fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. Every late night, every smile at his phone. Every small moment I had dismissed because it was easier to trust than to question. At some point, I turned onto my side. His phone was on the nightstand, closer to me than it usually was, face up, unlocked. For a second, I froze. My heart started beating faster. Not because I was afraid of what I might find, but because I wasn't sure I wanted to confirm it. I stared at the screen, the faint glow lighting up the darkness between us. I could see part of a message thread, not the full conversation. Just the most recent notification. Still sitting at the top. One name. Anna. No last name. No contact photo. Just Anna. My breath caught. But I didn't reach for the phone. Not yet. I lay there for a few seconds longer, watching the screen dim and go dark again. It would have been so easy. Just pick it up. Scroll. Know everything. But something inside me held back. I didn't want fragments. I didn't want half-truths pulled out of context. I wanted something undeniable. Something he couldn't twist or explain away. So I closed my eyes and forced myself to stay still. The next morning, I moved through my routine like nothing had changed. Coffee, shower, work. But inside, everything was different. The name stayed with me. Anna. It wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was real. Specific. Connected. Later that afternoon, I found myself replaying a conversation from a few weeks ago. Austin had mentioned someone at work, briefly. Casually. A new sales manager joined one of the accounts. He had said, scrolling through his phone. She's efficient. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, the memory felt sharper, clearer. I sat at my desk, staring at my computer screen, but not really seeing it. Anna, sales manager. The pieces weren't just floating anymore. They were starting to connect. That evening, when Austin came home, he greeted me the same way he always did. A quick kiss on the cheek. A tired smile. Hey, he said. Long day? Yeah, I replied, watching him carefully. Mine too. He moved past me, setting his things down, already reaching for his phone. And there it was again. That small smile. That same one. I felt something settle into place inside me. Quiet and steady. Not anger. Not yet. Just certainty. I didn't have proof. Not the kind I could put in front of him. But I had something else. Patterns. Details. Moments that didn't lie. And as I stood there, watching the man I had spent 5 years with move through a version of our life that no longer included me the way I thought it did, I realized something I couldn't ignore anymore. I wasn't imagining this. I was finally seeing it. And once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. I stopped looking at him for answers and started looking at the numbers instead. It was easier that way. People could lie. People could smile and say exactly what you needed to hear while hiding everything that mattered. But numbers didn't care about feelings. They didn't shift depending on the story someone wanted to tell. So one night, after Austin had fallen asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and logged into our shared account. The apartment was quiet. The kind of quiet that pressed in around you when everything else had already been said. The glow of the screen was the only light in the room, reflecting faintly off the glass surface of the table. For a moment, I just stared at the balance. Everything looked normal. Bills paid. Groceries accounted for. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would have raised alarms if I hadn't already been looking. Then I started scrolling. At first, it was just routine, skimming through transactions, letting my eyes move over the familiar rhythm of our spending. But then the pattern began to emerge. Slowly, almost subtly. A restaurant. I had seen the name before. High-end. Downtown. The kind of place people reserved weeks in advance. I clicked on the charge, expanding the details. The amount wasn't small, but it wasn't outrageous either. Just enough to blend in if you weren't paying attention. I scrolled further. Another charge. Same restaurant. Different date. Then another. My fingers paused on the trackpad. Individually, they meant nothing. Business dinners. Client meetings. Perfectly reasonable explanations for someone in Austin's line of work. But together, they started to feel like something else. I opened a new tab and pulled up the calendar app I used for everything. Appointments. Reminders. Random notes I didn't want to forget. I began cross-referencing the dates. The first charge matched a night he had come home late, apologizing for a last-minute event setup. The second aligned with a client dinner he said ran over time. The third. I remembered that one clearly. I had texted him that night, asking if he'd be home before 10. He had replied almost immediately. Probably not. Big event tonight. Don't wait up. I looked back at the transaction. Time-stamped. Same evening. Same hours. Same restaurant. Not an event venue. Not a conference space. A restaurant. I leaned back in my chair, my chest tightening just slightly. But not in the way I expected. There was no sharp pain. No overwhelming wave of emotion. Just something colder. Clearer. I went back further. Scanning weeks of transactions now. No longer just curious, but focused. Once I saw the pattern, I couldn't unsee it. The restaurant appeared again. And again. Always on nights he had work obligations. Always paired with vague explanations that never quite lined up with anything I could verify. I exhaled slowly, pressing my fingers lightly against my temples. Okay, I murmured under my breath. So this is real. But something else caught my attention. Some of the charges weren't labeled under the restaurant directly. They were categorized differently under event expenses. Vendor payments. Logistical costs. That made me pause. I clicked into one of them. The vendor name wasn't familiar. Not one of the usual suppliers Austin had mentioned in passing over the years. No recognizable branding. No clear description. Just a name. I copied it and pasted it into a search bar. Nothing useful came up. A few vague listings. No official website. No clear presence. That was strange. For someone working in event management, vendors were everything. Caterers. Decorators. Venues, they all had established footprints. They needed visibility. This one didn't. I went back to the transaction history, scanning for that same name. There it was again. And again. Smaller amounts. Spread out. Easy to overlook unless you were specifically looking for them. My heartbeat picked up. Not from panic, but from the realization that this might be bigger than I initially thought. This wasn't just dinners. This was money moving in ways that didn't make sense. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the screen, letting the implications settle. Then I did something I hadn't done before. I opened the most recent transaction from that restaurant, the one dated on our anniversary. 5 years? I clicked into the details, my eyes scanning every line. Reservation confirmed. 2 guests. Special request noted. I leaned closer, my breath slowing. There was a note attached to the booking. Short. Simple. Make it romantic. I stared at the words, reading them over and over again. Like they might change if I looked long enough. They didn't. My fingers curled slightly against the edge of the laptop. He hadn't forgotten. He hadn't been too busy. He hadn't overlooked the date. He had planned something. Just not with me. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the weight of that settle into something solid and undeniable. When I opened them again, everything felt sharper, clearer. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a rough patch or a temporary distance. It was deliberate, carefully planned, and it had been happening for longer than I wanted to admit. I scrolled back to the top of the page, looking at the timeline I had just built. Late nights, hidden messages, unfamiliar charges, a name, Anna, and now, a reservation. I reached for my phone, my movement steady, almost automatic. I searched for the restaurant online, pulling up their website, elegant photos, dim lighting, white tablecloths, reservations required. I clicked through to the booking page, checking availability for that night. Full. Every table, except for a few scattered openings at the edges of the floor plan. My eyes moved across the layout, taking in the arrangement, the spacing between tables. Close enough to see, close enough to hear. I felt something shift inside me then. Not grief, not anger, control. For days, I had been reacting, watching, observing, piecing things together. But this was different. This was the moment where I stopped following the story he was writing and started writing my own. I selected a table, Not across the room. Not hidden in a corner. Right next to theirs. Different name. Different contact. Same time. I confirmed the reservation without hesitating. The screen flashed briefly, then settled into a simple confirmation message. Table booked. I sat back in my chair, staring at it, feeling the quiet settle around me again. But it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. This one felt intentional, planned. I closed the laptop slowly, my reflection faintly visible in the dark screen. No tears, no hesitation, just a steady, unshakable clarity. That night, I didn't just find out the truth. I decided what I was going to do with it. And by the time that dinner came around, I wasn't going to be the one left in the dark anymore. I didn't confront him that night. I thought about it. More than once. I sat there at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand, the reservation confirmation still open on the screen, and imagined what it would look like if I walked into the bedroom and said his name the way I used to, soft, certain, expecting truth. I imagined placing the phone in front of him, asking one simple question, watching his face, the pause, the denial, the way he would twist it just enough to make me doubt what I already knew. I had seen that version of him too many times over the past few weeks. Not in obvious ways, just small ones, careful ones, enough to understand that confronting him now wouldn't give me clarity. It would give him time. Time to adjust the story. Time to clean up whatever mess he thought I might have found. And I wasn't going to give him that. So instead, I closed the phone, set it down, and did nothing. At least, nothing he could see. The next morning, everything felt strangely normal. Austin moved through the apartment the same way he always did, efficient, distracted, already half focused on whatever came next. He grabbed his jacket, checked his phone, poured his coffee without really tasting it. Busy today? I asked, leaning against the counter. Yeah, he said, not looking up. Got a couple of meetings. Then prep for the weekend. I nodded. What about Friday? I asked casually. He hesitated. Just for a second. Friday, he repeated. Our anniversary, I said, keeping my tone light. Almost teasing. 5 years? Kind of a big deal. He smiled then, but it didn't reach his eyes. Right, he said. I didn't forget. I've got something scheduled that night. Big client. I told you. I watched him carefully. You did, I said. There was a beat of silence. I'll make it up to you, he added quickly. We'll celebrate this weekend. Somewhere nice. Somewhere nice. I almost laughed. Instead, I just smiled. Of course, I said. Work comes first. He relaxed a little at that, like I had just confirmed something he needed to believe. Exactly, he said, grabbing his keys. I'll text you later. And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and the apartment fell into that familiar quiet again. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt like space. Space to think. Space to plan. I walked back to the table and picked up my phone, opening the reservation again. The details hadn't changed. Same time, same place, same note. Make it romantic. I stared at it for a moment, then opened the restaurant's website again, pulling up the seating layout. I had already booked the table next to them. That part was done. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something else. I wasn't the only one being lied to. The name sat in my mind like a quiet weight. Anna, sales manager, married. I hadn't looked into her yet. Not really. Just enough to connect the pieces. But now that I knew what night this was, what it meant, I needed to know more. I opened a new tab and searched her name. It didn't take long. A professional profile came up first. Clean. Polished. Exactly what you'd expect. Sales manager at a mid-sized firm. Industry connections. A few public photos from corporate events. In one of them, she was standing beside a man. Tall, well-dressed, hand resting lightly on her back. I clicked on the image. Another profile. Brandon? Director. His name was right there. Her husband. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. So this wasn't just a secret between two people. It was a lie built across two lives. For a moment, I hesitated. Reaching out to him would change everything. This wouldn't just be about me and Austin anymore. It would pull someone else into it. Someone who might not be ready. Someone who might not want to know. Or worse, someone who already did. I stared at his profile, my thumb hovering over the contact option. What if he didn't believe me? What if he told her? What if it all collapsed before I had the chance to do anything? I set the phone down, picked it up again, set it down. This wasn't just about exposing them. It was about control, about making sure the truth came out in a way that couldn't be twisted or denied. And right now, I didn't have that alone. But maybe we could... I picked up the phone again. My movement slower this time, more deliberate. I opened a message window and typed his name into the search bar. It appeared almost immediately. I stared at the empty message box for a long moment. What do you even say to someone like that? Hi, your wife is having an affair with my husband. Too blunt. Too easy to dismiss. I typed something else, then deleted it. Tried again. Deleted that too. This wasn't about emotion. It needed to be precise. Controlled. I took a breath and started again. There's something you need to know about Anna. I have reason to believe she's been meeting my husband. I have details, including a confirmed reservation for this Friday night. If you want the truth, we should talk. I read it over once. No accusations. No drama. Just facts. I hovered over the send button. My heart beating steadily now. Not racing. This was the moment where everything shifted. Once I sent it, there was no going back. No pretending. No waiting. I pressed send. The message disappeared into the thread. Simple and quiet. Like it didn't carry the weight of everything behind it. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then my phone buzzed. A reply. Short. Direct. Where and when? I stared at the screen, feeling something settle into place inside me. Not fear. Not doubt. Confirmation. I typed back the address of a cafe a few blocks from his office and a time for the next day. This time, I didn't hesitate. When I hit send, it felt different. Final. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair, my eyes drifting back to the reservation confirmation still open on my laptop. Same time. Same place. Same night. But now, it wasn't just their dinner anymore. That night, I didn't just book a table. I set the stage for everything that was about to happen. I got there 10 minutes early. The cafe sat on the corner of a quiet business street. All glass windows and polished wood. The kind of place people used for meetings they didn't want, overheard but also didn't want to hide. Midday light filtered in. Soft and neutral, making everything look calmer than it felt. I chose a table near the back where I could see the door. My coffee sat untouched in front of me, the steam fading as I watched people come and go, each one making my chest tighten for a second before I realized they weren't him. I wasn't nervous. Not exactly. Just aware. Aware that this was the moment things stopped being something I carried alone. The door opened again. And this time, I knew. He walked in with the kind of presence that didn't need attention to be noticed. Tall, composed, dressed like someone who moved through boardrooms without ever raising his voice. His eyes scanned the room once, sharp and efficient, until they landed on me. No hesitation. He walked straight over. "Melissa?" he asked. I nodded. "Brandon." We didn't shake hands. We just sat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It wasn't awkward, just measured, like we were both deciding how much to give, how much to hold back. He leaned back slightly in his chair, studying me. "You said you had details," he said finally. No anger, no disbelief, just a quiet demand for facts. I pulled my phone out and placed it on the table between us. Screen facing him, I didn't slide it over right away. I let him look at me first. "I'm not here to speculate," I said. "I'm here because I know something's happening. And I think you already do too." His expression didn't change. "Go on." I unlocked my phone and opened the reservation confirmation. The restaurant name. The date. The time. Friday night. I turned the screen toward him. He didn't react immediately. He just looked at it, his eyes moving slowly over the details. Then he nodded. "Once?" "I figured," he said quietly. "That caught me off guard." "You figured—" I repeated. He exhaled, leaning forward now, his forearms resting on the table. "She's been different," he said. "Late nights. Calls she takes in another room. Same pattern you described." There was no bitterness in his voice, just certainty. I felt something shift inside me then. Not relief exactly, but confirmation that this wasn't just in my head. "How long?" I asked. "A few weeks," he said. "Maybe longer." I stopped asking. I understood that. We sat there for a second, the weight of that shared realization settling between us. I didn't want to believe it. I admitted, "Not without something solid." "That's why you contacted me," he said. I nodded. He looked back down at the phone, then up at me again. "You said Friday," he said. "That date means something, doesn't it?" "It's our anniversary," I said. He held my gaze for a second longer than before. Then he leaned back again, his jaw tightening just slightly. "That's efficient," he said. The understatement almost made me laugh. "Almost." "I don't think this is new," I said. "There are patterns. Financial ones, too." That got his attention. His posture shifted, more focused now. "What kind of patterns?" I hesitated for half a second, then decided to be direct. Repeated charges at the same place. Vendor payments that don't make sense. Things that line up with his schedule and hers. Brandon's expression changed for the first time since he sat down. Not shock. Something sharper. "Same here," he said. "Different accounts. Same idea." I felt my fingers tighten slightly around my cup. "So it's not just the affair," I said. "No," he replied. "It's not." Silence settled again, heavier this time. Two people sitting across from each other, realizing the scope of what had been happening behind their backs. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, tapping a few times before placing it on the table. He didn't turn it toward me. "Not yet." "I've been tracking things," he said. "Not everything. Just enough to know something's off." "Why didn't you confront her?" I asked. He looked at me, his expression calm again. "Because once you confront, they adapt," he said. "They get better at hiding." That landed hard, because it was exactly what I had been thinking without putting into words. "I don't want better lies," he continued. "I want the truth." "So do I." We sat there, the understanding between us no longer tentative. It was solid. "So what do you want to do?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the reservation again, then back at me. "What happens Friday?" he asked. "They go to dinner," I said. "Like nothing's wrong." "And you?" "I was supposed to stay home," I said. "Wait. Pretend it's just another night." He nodded slowly. Then a faint, almost imperceptible shift crossed his face. Not anger, not pain. Something more controlled than that. "What if you don't?" he said. I held his gaze. "What do you mean?" "What if you go?" he asked. "Not to confront them. Not right away." I felt my heartbeat pick up. Just slightly. "Then what?" I asked. He leaned forward again, his voice lowering. "Then you let them show you exactly what this is," he said. In their own words, in their own actions. I thought about that for a second. The restaurant, the table, the way Austin had planned it, the way he thought he controlled the narrative. And then, I asked. Brandon's eyes didn't leave mine. "Then we decide when it ends," he said. Something settled inside me at that moment. Not fear. Not hesitation. Control. This wasn't about catching them anymore. It wasn't about guessing or doubting or waiting for confirmation. It was about choosing the moment. Choosing how the truth came out. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. I already booked a table, I said. His eyebrows lifted just slightly. Where? Right next to them. For the first time. A faint trace of something like approval crossed his expression. Good, he said. We didn't smile. There was nothing about this that was light. But there was something else now. Alignment. We don't rush it, he added. We don't give them time to adjust. We let them think they're safe. I nodded. And when they're not, I asked. He held my gaze. Steady and unshaken. That's when the truth matters most, he said. I looked down at the reservation one last time. Friday night. Same place. Same table. But now, it wasn't their secret anymore. It was something we were about to reveal. We met again 2 days later. This time in a place that felt nothing like a cafe. Brandon had chosen it, a private conference room in his office building. Quiet. Sealed off from everything else. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. But the blinds were half drawn, muting the light. It felt intentional. Controlled. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was planning. He was already there when I walked in, standing by the table with a folder laid out in front of him. He didn't greet me with small talk. Just a nod. You came? He said. I said I would. I closed the door behind me, the click echoing just enough to make the room feel even more isolated. For a moment, neither of us sat. Then he gestured toward the chair across from him. Let's do this right, he said. I took the seat, setting my bag beside me. My movement steady, deliberate. No nerves. No hesitation. Just focus. He opened the folder and slid a few documents toward me. Not dramatically. Not like he was trying to impress or overwhelm. Just facts. Start here, he said. I looked down. Transaction summaries? Dates. Amounts. Different accounts than mine. But the pattern was unmistakable. Restaurants. Vendors. Transfers that didn't quite line up with legitimate expenses. I exhaled slowly. It's the same, I said. Just more of it. He nodded. I've been tracking it for a while, he said. Not everything, just enough to see the structure. Structure, I repeated. This isn't random, he said. It's consistent. Repeated. That means it's intentional. That word settled into the room. Intentional. Not a mistake. Not a moment of weakness. A system. I leaned back slightly, my eyes moving over the papers again. And she knows, I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, she benefits. That was enough. I didn't need more explanation. Silence filled the space for a second, heavier than before. Then I closed the folder and looked up at him. So we don't confront them, I said. No, he replied. Not yet. We don't call them out before Friday. No. I nodded slowly. Because if we do, they clean it up, I said. Exactly. There was no disagreement between us anymore. No uncertainty. Just alignment. I leaned forward, resting my elbows lightly on the table. So we let them go to dinner, I said. We let them think everything is normal. And we watch, he added. For how long? He considered that for a moment. Until they forget to be careful, he said. I felt a small, sharp sense of recognition at that. Because that was already happening. They had gotten comfortable. Careless. That's why I was here. That won't take long, I said quietly. His gaze met mine. Steady. No, he agreed. It won't. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, opening the reservation details again. Same time, I said. Same layout. I checked the floor plan. I turned the screen toward him, showing him the table placements. Ours. Theirs? Close enough to hear every word. He studied it for a second, then nodded. Good positioning, he said. I almost smiled. Almost. We arrived separately, I said. No contact beforehand. No signals. He nodded again. And we don't engage right away, he added. We let them settle in first. I thought about that. The idea of sitting there, watching them, letting it play out. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I can do that, I said. He didn't question it. I know. There was a pause. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since our last meeting. How far does this go? I said. The financial part. He leaned back slightly, his expression shifting just enough to tell me the answer mattered. Far enough that it won't stay between us, he said. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters right now, he replied. I held his gaze. He wasn't avoiding the question. He was controlling the timing, and I understood why. So Friday isn't just about the affair, I said. No, he said. It's about everything connected to it. I sat with that for a moment. The weight of it. The scale. This wasn't just personal anymore. It was bigger. Monsieur. More dangerous. What happens after? I asked. He didn't hesitate this time. That depends on what they show us, he said. That answer felt right. Not rushed. Not forced. Just precise. I nodded. Okay. We sat in silence for a few seconds, the plan settling into place between us. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just two people who had been lied to, deciding how the truth would come out. I glanced down at the papers again, then back up. Why are you so calm? I asked. It wasn't an accusation, just curiosity. He didn't look surprised by the question. Because I've already gone through everything else, he said. Anger. Denial. All of it. And now I just want it to be real, he said. Real. Not hidden. Not explained away. Just undeniable. I understood that. More than I wanted to. I picked up my phone and locked the screen, sliding it back into my bag. No improvising? I said. We stick to the plan. Always, he replied. No confrontation until the right moment. Yes. No losing control. He held my gaze again. That part's up to you, he said. I didn't look away. I won't, I said. And I meant it. Because this wasn't about emotion anymore. It wasn't about reacting. It was about choosing the moment when everything changed. I stood up, and he did the same. No handshake. No final words. Just a shared understanding that didn't need anything else. As I reached the door, I paused for a second, my hand resting on the handle. By the time Friday comes, I said quietly, they won't even realize what's about to happen. Behind me, his voice was calm. That's the point. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, the noise of the building rushing back in around me. But inside, everything felt steady, clear, set. Because by the time that dinner started, it wasn't going to be their night anymore. It was going to be ours. I arrived 10 minutes before them. The host smiled politely as I gave the name I had used for the reservation, then led me through the dim, softly lit dining room. The place looked exactly like it had in the photos. Dark wood, low golden light, quiet conversations blending into a smooth, almost soothing hum. It would have been perfect if I hadn't known why I was there. Right this way, the host said, stopping beside a table near the center of the room. I glanced across the space immediately, my eyes moving without hesitation. And there it was. Their table? Not far. Not hidden. Exactly where I expected it to be. Close enough. Is this okay? The host asked. I nodded. It's perfect. I sat down slowly, placing my purse beside my chair. My movements calm, measured. From where I was, I had a clear view of the entrance and, more importantly, of their table. Empty. For now. I folded my hands lightly in front of me, forcing myself to breathe evenly. to stay grounded in the moment instead of rushing ahead to what was coming. This was the part we had planned.
Wait.
Observe. Let them walk into it. A few minutes later, I saw Brandon enter. He didn't look around the room the way most people did. Just a brief scan. Precise. Controlled. Until his eyes landed on me. No acknowledgement. No signal. He walked past me as if I were a stranger and took his seat across from me. Good timing, I said quietly. He gave the slightest nod. They're not here yet, I added. They will be, he said. We didn't say anything else. There was nothing to say. The server came by, took our orders, and left us alone again. The normalcy of it all felt surreal, like we were just two people having dinner, not sitting on the edge of something that was about to change everything. Then the door opened. I didn't need to look. I felt it. Still. I did. Austin walked in first. His posture relaxed. His expression easy. He wore the same jacket he had left the house in earlier. The one I had seen him adjust in the mirror before telling me he had a big client event. Behind him, Anna. She looked exactly like the photos, elegant, confident, completely at ease beside him. Her hand brushed lightly against his arm as they spoke, their heads leaning slightly toward each other like it was second nature. They didn't hesitate. They didn't look around. They walked straight to their table, like they had done this before. I felt something tighten in my chest. But it wasn't the sharp pain I had expected. It was steadier than that. Final. They're comfortable, Brandon said under his breath. Yes, I replied. They are. We didn't move. We didn't speak again. We just watched. The server greeted them, poured water, handed them menus. They barely looked at them. Their attention was on each other, on whatever quiet conversation had been building long before they walked through that door. Anna laughed softly at something Austin said. He smiled back. That smile. The same one I had seen so many times across our own table. Only now, it wasn't mine anymore. I lowered my gaze for a second, letting the moment settle, then looked back up. This wasn't new. That was the part that mattered. This wasn't an accident or a sudden mistake. It was routine. Anna reached across the table, her fingers brushing his wrist. He didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand slightly, letting her hold it. The gesture was small, quiet, but it said everything. Brandon shifted slightly in his seat across from me. Just enough that I knew he had seen it too. Not the first time, he murmured. No, I said. It's not. A server passed by, placing a basket of bread on our table. I thanked her automatically, my voice steady, my expression calm. From the outside, nothing about us looked unusual. That was the point. I glanced back at them as Anna leaned forward, lowering her voice. This is better than last time, she said, just loud enough to carry across the space between us. Austin chuckled softly. I told you I'd make it worth it. Last time. The words landed heavier than anything else had so far. It confirmed what we already knew, but hearing it, in their own voices, in this setting, made it real in a way nothing else had. Ongoing. Intentional. Comfortable. I felt my fingers tighten slightly against the edge of the table, but I forced myself to relax. Not yet. Brandon caught the movement, his gaze lifting to mine briefly. Wait, he said quietly. I nodded. We let a few more minutes pass. They ordered wine, shared a plate. Their conversation flowed easily, naturally, like there was no part of this that felt wrong to them, like this was exactly where they were supposed to be. Then Austin leaned forward again, his voice softer this time. I didn't want to wait until the weekend, he said. Tonight felt right. Anna smiled. I'm glad you didn't, she said. That was it. That was the moment everything inside me went completely still. No more doubt. No more questions. Just truth. I stood up. Slowly. Deliberately. Brandon didn't stop me this time. I walked past their table without looking at them. My steps, even. Controlled, like I had done this 100 times before. I reached the table just beside theirs and pulled out the chair. Sat down. Brandon followed a second later, taking his seat across from me as if nothing had changed. For a moment, they didn't notice. Their conversation continued, soft and private. Then Anna's voice faltered. I saw it happen in her reflection first, the slight shift. The pause. She looked up. Her eyes landed on Brandon, and everything froze. Austin turned toward her, confused. What? Then he followed her gaze. His eyes met mine, and I watched the exact moment the night he had planned so carefully began to fall apart. For a second, no one moved. Austin's hand was still half extended across the table, his fingers hovering where Anna's had been a moment before. The smile on his face didn't fade so much as fracture, like something breaking beneath the surface before the pieces had time to fall. Melissa, he said. My name sounded unfamiliar coming from him in that moment. Softer than I expected. Careful, like he wasn't sure which version of me he was talking to. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch. Just long enough for the weight of it to settle over all four of us. Around us. The restaurant carried on, glasses clinking. Low voices blending together, but at our corner. Everything felt contained. Suspended, Anna was the first to move. She pulled her hand back from the table completely, her posture stiffening as she looked from me to Brandon and back again. Confusion flickered across her face, quickly replaced by something sharper. Recognition. Brandon? She said, her voice tight. He didn't respond. He just looked at her. Calm, steady, the same expression he had worn since the moment we sat down. That silence seemed to unsettle her more than anything else. Austin pushed his chair back slightly, the legs scraping softly against the floor. He stood halfway, like he wasn't sure whether to sit or leave or pretend this wasn't happening. What are you doing here? He asked, looking at me again, still careful, still trying to control the tone. I met his gaze. I could ask you the same thing, I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Something shifted in his expression then. The confusion sharpened into calculation, like he was already searching for a way to reframe the moment. This isn't what it looks like, he said quickly. Of course it wasn't. It never was. Anna let out a small breath beside him, her shoulders lifting as if she was preparing to speak. But the words didn't come immediately. She looked at Brandon again, her eyes searching his face for something, understanding. Maybe, or permission. She didn't find it. What is this? She asked instead, her voice turning defensive. Why are you here? Brandon leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting loosely on the table. I think that's the question, he said. His tone was calm. Too calm. Anna flinched. Just barely. Austin stepped in before she could respond. Melissa, we can talk about this, he said, lowering his voice. Privately. He glanced around the restaurant, clearly aware now of the proximity of other tables, of the fact that this wasn't as contained as he would have liked. I followed his gaze for a second, then looked back at him. No, I said simply. The word landed between us. Final. His jaw tightened. This isn't the place, he added. Trying again. You're misunderstanding. Am I? I interrupted. He stopped. For a moment, he didn't answer. That was all it took. Anna straightened in her chair, her expression shifting again, this time into something more controlled. Composed? You're making a scene, she said, her tone sharp now. Whatever you think is going on. Anna. Brandon's voice cut through hers. Not loud. Just precise. She froze. The way he said her name, no emotion, no hesitation, pulled her attention back to him immediately. He held her gaze. You don't have to pretend, he said. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Austin stepped closer to the table, his hand hovering near the back of Anna's chair, like he was trying to position himself between us and her. This is ridiculous, he said, more forcefully now. We're just having dinner. With who? I asked. The question hung there. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked at me, something sharper flashing in his eyes. You're overreacting, he said. You've been distant lately. And now you show up here and... I almost smiled. There it was. The shift. The attempt to turn it back on me. I leaned forward slightly, my hand still resting calmly on the table. Say her name, I said. He blinked. What? Say her name, I repeated. Tell me who you're having dinner with. Silence. Anna's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. Brandon didn't move. Austin's mouth opened, then closed again. He knew. He knew exactly what I was asking him to do. And he couldn't. See? I said softly. The word barely carried. But it was enough. Anna let out a small, frustrated breath. This is insane, she said, turning toward Austin. You didn't tell me. I didn't know she was coming. He snapped back. That was the first crack. Small, but visible. Brandon's gaze shifted slightly, focusing on Anna now. You didn't know, he repeated. She looked at him again, and this time, the composure slipped. Brandon, this isn't... What is it? Then, he asked. Still calm, still steady. But there was something underneath it now. Pressure. She hesitated. Just long enough. That hesitation said more than any explanation she could have given. Around us, I could feel the shift in the room. Conversations at nearby tables had quieted just enough. Attention subtly drifting toward us. Austin noticed it too. Sit down, he muttered under his breath to Anna, his voice tight. We're leaving. He reached for his jacket, his movements sharper now, less controlled. But he didn't move away. Not yet. Because he couldn't. Not without answering. Not without acknowledging what was already out in the open. I watched him. Really watched him. And for the first time since this started, I saw it clearly. He was afraid. Not of me. Of what this moment meant. Of what came next. Brandon shifted slightly in his seat. Just enough to draw their attention again. We're not done, he said. Austin's eyes snapped to him. What do you want? He asked. Frustration breaking through now. Brandon held his gaze. The truth, he said. The words settled into the space between us, heavier than anything that had been said so far. Anna looked down at the table. Austin didn't respond. And in that silence, in that pause where neither of them could find a version of the story that worked anymore, I felt something inside me settle. Not anger. Not even satisfaction. Just clarity. Because whatever they thought this was, an awkward encounter, a misunderstanding, something they could talk their way out of. It wasn't. This was the beginning of everything coming apart. And they were just starting to realize it. This isn't just about cheating, Brandon said. His voice didn't rise. But it cut through everything else at the table. Even the low music seemed to fade behind it. Austin let out a sharp breath, like he was trying to reset the moment, to pull it back into something manageable. You don't know what you're talking about, he said. Brandon didn't even look at him. Actually, he replied, I do. I felt my attention sharpen. This was the part we hadn't said out loud yet. The part that went beyond late nights and hidden messages. Austin stepped closer to the table. His posture stiff now, controlled in a way that felt forced. This is between me and my wife, he said, glancing at me. You don't get to... Sit down, Austin, I said. He froze. Not because I raised my voice. I didn't. But because I didn't sound like I used to. For a second, he hesitated. Then, slowly, he lowered himself back into his chair. Anna watched the exchange, her eyes moving between us, her composure cracking just slightly at the edges. What is he talking about? She asked, her voice quieter now. Brandon finally looked at her. You know exactly what I'm talking about, he said. She shook her head quickly. No. I don't. This is... Then I'll be specific, he interrupted. The words landed clean. Precise. Austin leaned forward immediately. Don't, he said. Too fast. Too urgent. Brandon's gaze shifted to him for just a moment. That's interesting, he said. You're not even asking what I'm about to say. Silence. Austin's jaw tightened. Because you already know, Brandon added. I could feel the tension building again. Thicker this time. Heavier. What are you talking about? Anna asked again. But there was something different in her voice now. Less certainty. More fear. Brandon reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his phone. He didn't unlock it right away. He just held it there, letting the moment stretch. Transactions, he said. Patterns. Austin laughed. But it came out wrong. Forced. Business expenses, he said quickly. You wouldn't understand. I understand numbers just fine, Brandon replied. That shut him up. I leaned forward slightly, my hand still steady on the table. So do I said. Austin's eyes flicked to me. For a second, something like realization crossed his face. You went through the accounts, he said. Not a question. A statement. I held his gaze. Yes. Anna's head turned sharply toward him. What accounts? She asked. He didn't answer. Brandon did. Event budgets, he said. Vendor payments. Charges that don't match actual services. Anna stared at him, then at Austin. That's not, she started. It is, Brandon said calmly. He unlocked his phone, then tapping a few times before placing it on the table between us. He didn't push it toward them. He didn't need to. Same dates, he continued. Same locations. Same people involved. Austin leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. This is ridiculous, he muttered. You're twisting things you don't understand. Then explain it, I said. He looked at me again, his expression tightening. I don't have to explain my work to you, he said. That was the second crack. Not denial. Deflection. Anna's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Austin, she said quietly. What is he talking about? He didn't look at her. He was still looking at me. This has nothing to do with you, he said. It was the wrong answer. I saw it in her face the second he said it. Her expression shifted, the last piece of her composure slipping. Nothing to do with me, she repeated. Brandon watched her, his eyes steady. You're part of it, he said. She shook her head, faster this time. No, I'm not. I don't. You knew about the transfers, he said. Her voice stopped. Just stopped. The silence that followed was louder than anything that had been said. Austin closed his eyes for a second, like he was trying to hold something together that was already falling apart. Don't, he said again. But it came out weaker this time. Too late. Anna looked at him slowly. You told me it was just accounting, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper now. That it was adjustments. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The realization hit her all at once. Not just that he had been lying to his wife, but that he had been lying to her too. You said it was safe, she added, her voice shaking now. That no one would notice. I felt something inside me go still again. That was it. Not just an affair. Not just betrayal. A system. A plan. And both of them were part of it. Austin opened his eyes, looking at her now. I told you not to say anything, he said under his breath. That was the moment everything broke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just completely. Brandon leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged. Thank you, he said. Anna looked at him, confused. For what? For confirming it, he replied. Around us. I could feel the shift in the room again. Conversations had quieted. Eyes had turned. People were pretending not to listen. But they were. Austin noticed it too. He pushed his chair back abruptly, the movement sharper this time. We're done here, he said. All of you? But he didn't stand. He couldn't. because leaving now wouldn't fix anything. It would only confirm what was already clear. I watched him, taking in the way his confidence had cracked, the way his control had slipped piece by piece. This wasn't the man who had walked into the restaurant earlier. That man had been sure of everything. This one wasn't sure of anything anymore. Anna leaned back in her chair, her hands trembling slightly now. "What did you do?" she asked him. He didn't answer. Again. And that silence said more than any explanation he could have given. I felt my breathing steady, my thoughts clear. This wasn't about catching him anymore. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about ending it. Right here. Right now. I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm. "You didn't just lie to me," I said. "You built something behind my back." He looked at me, something desperate flickering in his eyes. "It's not what you think," he said. I almost smiled. "It is," I replied, and this time, there was nothing left for him to say. The illusion was gone. The story he had been telling, to me, to her, to himself, had collapsed. And sitting there, in the middle of a restaurant meant for celebration, with everyone watching and no way to take it back, he finally understood what that meant. He had lost control, and everything he thought he could hide was already out in the open. We didn't stay long after that. There was nothing left to say. Austin tried, of course, as we stood from the table, as the noise of the restaurant slowly returned to something resembling normal. He stepped in front of me like he could still block the exit, like he could still control where this went. "Melissa." "Wait," he said, his voice low. Urgent now. I stopped, not because he asked me to, because I wanted to see what he would do next. He looked different standing there, less composed, less certain. The confidence he had walked in with was gone, replaced by something tighter, more desperate. "We need to talk," he said. I tilted my head slightly. "We just did." "Not like this," he insisted. "Not in front of." He glanced around, lowering his voice even further. "People." I held his gaze. "You didn't seem concerned about that 10 minutes ago." His jaw clenched. "This isn't what it looks like," he said again. The same line. Still trying. I almost admired the consistency. "Then explain it," I said. He opened his mouth, closed it. For a moment, nothing came out. That silence stretched between us, heavy and undeniable. "I can fix this," he said finally. That was new. Not denial, not deflection. A promise. Too late. I shook my head once. "No," I said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Something in his expression shifted then, like he was realizing, piece by piece, that whatever version of this he thought he could recover didn't exist anymore. Behind him, Anna stood a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself, her posture smaller than before. Brandon was near the door, waiting, not watching, not intervening. "Just present." Austin glanced back at her briefly, then at me again. "You're overreacting," he said. "Trying one last time. We can figure this out." I let out a quiet breath. "No," I repeated. And then I stepped past him. I didn't look back. The cool air outside hit my face the second I walked out of the restaurant. It felt different from when I had gone in. Sharper. Cleaner. Like something had been cut away. Brandon stepped out a moment later, the door closing softly behind him. For a second, we stood there in silence, the city moving around us. Cars passing, people walking by, unaware of what had just happened inside. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. Yes. And I meant it. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it was done. He studied me for a second, then gave a small nod of his own. "Good," he said. We didn't say anything else. There was nothing else to say. We walked in opposite directions. I went home alone. That night was quiet in a different way. Not the heavy silence I had gotten used to over the past few weeks, Not the kind filled with unanswered questions and things I was trying not to see. The silence was clear. Final. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing for a while, letting everything settle. 5 years. It didn't end with a fight. It didn't end with tears. It ended with clarity. My phone buzzed. I looked down at it. Austin. Of course. I didn't answer. Another message came in seconds later. Then another. Calls. Texts. Each one more urgent than the last. We need to talk. Please just listen. It's not what you think. I stared at the screen for a moment, then set the phone face down on the nightstand, just like he used to. The irony didn't escape me. The next morning, the messages kept coming. Not just from him. Unknown numbers. Short. Vague texts. We heard something happened last night. Hope everything's okay. It didn't take long to understand what was happening. He was moving fast, trying to get ahead of it, control the story before it spread too far. I let him. At first, I went to work like I always did, moved through my day like nothing had changed. People smiled, asked about my week, made small talk about things that felt distant now. But underneath it, I could feel the shift, the quiet ripple of something moving beyond my control. By the afternoon, Brandon called. Have you seen it? He asked. Seen what? Give it an hour, he said. You will? He wasn't wrong. It started subtly. A comment here, a message there. Fragments of a story that didn't quite match what I had lived through. That I had caused a scene. That I had misunderstood something. That things had been complicated for a while. I read them all. Didn't respond. Not yet. That was the part Austin still didn't understand. Silence wasn't weakness. It was space. Space to decide what mattered. That evening, Brandon sent me a file. Not a message. Not a question. Just a file. I opened it slowly. Transactions. Timelines. Details that lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. This was different from what we had discussed before. Deeper, clearer, undeniable. He followed it with one line. This is what they can't explain. I looked at the screen, my mind moving through the implications, the connections, the way everything fit together. This wasn't just something we knew anymore. It was something we could prove. My phone buzzed again. Austin. Calling. I let it ring. Then stop. Then ring again. I picked it up this time. Not to answer, just to look at his name on the screen. For a moment, I remembered what that name used to mean. Then I set the phone down again, face down, and left it there. Because by then, I understood something he didn't. I didn't need to destroy him. He was already doing that on his own. A few months later, my life didn't look anything like it used to. Not in the way people expect when they think of endings. There was no dramatic collapse. No moment where everything fell apart all at once. It was quieter than that. More deliberate. I had moved into a smaller apartment on the north side of Chicago. Nothing fancy. Just enough space to feel like mine. The kind of place where every decision, every piece of furniture, every detail came from me. Not from a version of us that no longer existed. At first, the silence felt unfamiliar. Then it started to feel like peace. The divorce didn't take long. Not because it was easy, but because I didn't fight it. I didn't argue over things that no longer mattered. I didn't try to hold on to anything tied to a life that had already ended before I acknowledged it. Austin tried to reach out in the beginning. Calls, messages, emails that got longer and more desperate over time. I read a few of them. Most, I didn't. There was a moment, early on, where I considered responding, not to fix anything, but to understand, to ask the questions that still lingered in the back of my mind. Why? How long? Was any of it real? But the more time passed, the less those questions mattered, because the answers wouldn't change what had already happened, and I didn't need them to move forward. I saw him once after everything settled. Not up close. Just across the street. Outside a building I didn't recognize. He looked different. Not in a dramatic way. Just smaller. The kind of difference that comes when someone loses something they didn't realize they depended on. He didn't see me, and I didn't call out to him. I stood there for a second, watching him check his phone, run a hand through his hair, glance around like he was waiting for something that wasn't coming. Then I turned and walked the other way. No anger. No satisfaction. Just distance. I heard things, of course, about him, about Anna. Stories travel fast when people are involved. He lost clients. That part made sense. People in his line of work rely on trust, on reputation, on the illusion of control. Once that cracks, everything else follows. Anna's situation wasn't much better. Professional consequences, social fallout, a quiet unraveling that didn't need to be loud to be complete. I didn't follow the details. I didn't need to. Their lives were no longer connected to mine. And that was the point. Brandon and I stayed in touch. Not constantly. Not in a way that felt forced or complicated. Just occasionally. A message here. A call there. Two people who understood something most others didn't. We never talked about that night in detail. We didn't have to. It was already part of both our lives in a way that didn't need revisiting. Sometimes, that's enough. I focused on my work again. Not the way I had before, just going through the motions. Filling time, but with intention. I took on new clients. Pushed myself in ways I hadn't before. Said yes to opportunities I might have hesitated over in the past. Little by little, I started to recognize something in myself that had been buried under routine and expectation. Confidence. Not the kind that comes from being part of something stable. The kind that comes from knowing you can stand on your own when everything shifts. One afternoon, I found myself back near that same restaurant. I hadn't planned it. I was meeting a client nearby, and as I walked past, I recognized the entrance immediately. The same soft lighting, the same polished glass. For a second, I stopped. Not because it hurt, but because it felt like looking at a place that belonged to a different version of me. I stepped inside. Just for a moment. The atmosphere hadn't changed. The same quiet conversations. The same music. The same carefully arranged tables. But I stood there, taking it in, and realized something I hadn't fully put into words before. That night, it wasn't the worst thing that had ever happened to me. It was the moment everything became clear. The moment I stopped waiting for someone else to choose me, and chose myself instead. I turned and walked back out into the afternoon light, the door closing softly behind me. No hesitation. No second glance. Just forward. Because the truth is, the real revenge wasn't sitting at that table. It wasn't exposing them. It wasn't watching everything fall apart. It was this walking away, building something new, living a life that no longer had space for the version of me that accepted less than she deserved. And maybe that's the part people don't talk about enough. Because it's quieter, less dramatic, but stronger. If you've ever had a moment like that, where everything you thought was certain suddenly wasn't, I'd really want to hear your story. Sometimes just saying it out loud or writing it down changes how it feels. And if this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of something you've been through or something you're still figuring out, then stay. There are more stories like this. More moments where things fall apart, and something stronger takes their place. You don't have to go through it alone. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.